Years old when he was first elected to the Quebec legislature. He won as a member of the party he founded, the Action démocratique du Québec, or ADQ. Dumont started favoring sovereignty for Quebec in the early years, but since then, his party has pushed for a strong Quebec within Canada. For years, the ADQ seems stalled as a small player in Quebec without making big election gains. So one of the big questions in the Quebec election of 2007, would the ADQ finally make a major breakthrough? The CBC's Nancy Wood set the scene on the day the campaign began.
The hugs and kisses can't change the fact that Jean Charest has spent much of the last 4 years an unpopular premier. Now he's betting the worst is over and that Quebecers will give him a second chance, a second term.
Le Parti libéral du Québec a fait ses devoirs.
We've done our homework. We're ready, he says. The polls show that right now it's a tight race.
It will be the first time we'll have a real three-way battle at the provincial level in Quebec since the 30s.
Right behind the Liberals is the Parti québécois, led by André Boisclair.
I think that Quebecers are looking for hope. I think that Quebecers are very unsatisfied by the record of Mr. Charest.
But Boisclair has seen a PQ lead slip through his fingers in the last year. That may be one reason he kicked off the campaign with a personal attack against Charest, calling him a liar over the government's new policy on tuition fees.
Je vais aujourd'hui à nouveau rappeler le premier mensonge de Jean Charest.
I will remind people of his first lie, said the PQ leader. Charest has made it clear he'll hit back.
If André Boisclair chooses integrity as an issue, if he makes that choice, not me, I will defend myself.
Which is widely interpreted as the Liberals being ready to attack Boisclair for his past drug use. But Charest will also have to fend off Mario Dumont, the popular leader of the right-leaning Action démocratique party.
We firmly believe that we have the best political offer.
People, you know what they want? They want Mario Dumont as the Prime Minister. They want to vote for the Liberal Party, and they want to apply the PQ program.
During the next month, Jean Charest will try to position himself as the leader who can get the best results from Ottawa for this province. A big part of that strategy will depend on a federal budget that's generous to Quebec and tabled exactly 1 week before Quebecers decide who will make the best premier. Nancy Wood, CBC News, Quebec City.
Through the course of the campaign, there were ups and downs for all three parties. Again, here's Nancy Wood reporting from the midpoint on the night of a debate among the leaders.
This staged moment of harmony between three rivals lasted only seconds. Before long, the debate had taken on the nasty tone of the campaign. Action démocratique leader Mario Dumont suggested the government had ignored warnings from its own transport department about an overpass that collapsed last fall, killing 5 people. The presence of cracks is of concern, he read.
Je n'ai jamais vu le document.
I've never seen that document, said Liberal leader Jean Charest. In a tight race that seems to come down to who would make the best leader, every word and action counted. When Jean Charest called this election 3 weeks ago, the Liberals were in good shape, leading the polls. Charest's chief opponent, André Boisclair, was relatively new to his job as leader, sinking in the polls and battling dissent in his own party. On top of that, and perhaps unexpectedly, a radio host raised the issue of Boisclair's homosexuality, suggesting factory workers wouldn't vote for a gay leader.
Vous savez quoi? Je vais laisser les Québécois répondre à cette question-là.
I'll leave that up to Quebecers to decide, Boisclair replied, clearly banking on the province's generally tolerant views. While Boisclair faltered and Quebecers looked for an alternative to Charest, Mario Dumont emerged. His socially conservative Action démocratique party struck a chord with many francophone voters as he vowed to protect Quebec culture in the face of immigration. Dumont's biggest challenge, keeping his candidates in line. For example, he had to drop one who said ethnics would swamp Quebec. The other leaders have had their own challenges. Boisclair had to defend one PQ candidate who questioned the genocide in Rwanda. And Charest had one of his party veterans suggest the Liberals hadn't done enough on health care. Tonight's debate brought the attention back to the leaders, with Dumont's rising popularity making him the main target. Polls show this three-way race is so tight that Quebeckers could end up with a minority government. But the same polls show that almost half of voters are still undecided. With less than 2 weeks to go, how voters judge the leaders' performances tonight could make all the difference. Nancy Wood, CBC News, Quebec City.
Now to Election Day, a day that proved right all the experts who said it would be oh so close. It was. The Liberals returned to government, but with a minority of 48 seats. A big surprise to many, the surge of the ADQ to win 41 seats. That's way up from the 5 they had before the election. The Parti Québécois ended up in third place with 36 seats. A minority can make it difficult for a government to do things because it needs the support of one of the other parties to pass votes in the legislature. But some people think that's a good thing, that it makes governments move more carefully. Now Quebec has its first minority government since 1878. Here's the CBC's Nancy Wood to wrap up the results.
One look at Mario Dumont and his troops, and you'd think he won the Quebec election.
We partied last night, but we're back to work today. It's as simple as that. We certainly are a party very happy.
Happy with second place? But what a second place. The Action Démocratique vaulted from 5 seats to the party that will form the official opposition.
Yes, we will question the government, we'll push the government towards action. We will be constructive, make proposals, make suggestions as to what the government might do or should do.
The sudden rise of the ADQ with its conservative agenda delighted some Quebeckers.
It's time for a change, and we're glad to see Mario Dumont in there. And looks to be a shift towards the right in Quebec.
But is a concern to others.
The only really troubling thing is kind of the subtle xenophobia that he hinted on at points, which really kind of picked up in the regions.
It may be a sign that the breakthrough the federal Conservatives made in the last election was not an isolated incident.
We've seen this shift to the right over the last 10 years. It's almost as if we were having the common sense revolution of 15 years ago in Quebec. And all indicators that we're trending over time shows that we are moving to the right.
The Liberal Premier, Jean Charest, appeared chastened.
And I accept the fact that the people who voted yesterday sent a message to the government, and a number of people are not satisfied.
Not satisfied with the Liberal record nor the sovereignty option. The Parti Québécois had its worst showing in over 30 years.
It's clear that we will have to adjust our platform, adjust our strategy.
But for now, he says, not its leader. Boisclair is staying on.
He may be firmly seated in his position right now, but he's not the one with the button on the ejection seat.
Others agree, saying there's bound to be deep discontent, given that the sovereignty movement stalled under Boisclair.
Monsieur Boisclair obviously didn't fit with the Quebec outside of Montreal.
Still, analysts cautioned against reading too much into the results.
The sovereignty movement has certainly taken a hit with the results of the Quebec election, but nationalism is not dead in Quebec. A lot of nationalists voted for the ADQ.
Still, Quebec sovereigntists have to face one troubling fact. All told, over 65% of Quebecers who voted for a federalist option. Nancy Wood, CBC News, Montreal.
It's not clear how Jean Charest's minority government will actually work. Mario Dumont says he is prepared to support it on an issue-by-issue basis. But many Quebecers believe it won't be long before they'll have to vote again. And that's News in Review. I'm Carla Robinson. Thanks for watching. They were murdered by a brutal group of racists.
We learned that this boy, whose body we found yesterday and which has tentatively been identified as Charles Edward Moore.
Their killers got away with it until these two men went looking for justice.
Why don't you come out and be a man? All I want to do is talk to you, punk.
Go get back in your car.
On News and Review today, Mississippi cold case. Hello, I'm Carla Robinson. This is the story of the brutal murder of 2 black teenagers in the United States and how it took more than 40 years for 2 of their killers to be brought to justice. It happened in the southern state of Mississippi in May 1964 during the height of the civil rights era. It was a hateful time. Police were investigating the death of 3 young civil rights workers whose story would one day be made into a movie called Mississippi Burning, when they came across the bodies of the 2 black teenagers. Henry D. and Charles Moore were hitchhiking when they disappeared. 2 months later, when their bodies were pulled out of the Mississippi River, it was clear they had been murdered. 2 men were arrested but later released, and for decades the case remained unsolved, until a CBC producer, David Ridgen, decided to look up the brother of one of the victims, Thomas Moore, and the 2 men began a remarkable journey for justice.
After an 11-month search, I finally found Thomas Moore, retired and living quietly at his last Army posting in Colorado Springs. I had a proposal for him that we make a documentary film together that looked back at the brutal Klan killings of his brother Charles Moore and his friend Henry D. in 1964 Mississippi.
This document here is a 9-page document from the Federal Bureau of Investigation dated January 12, 1965.
Despite the fact that the Klan murders of Dee and Moore were completely overshadowed by the famous white victims of the Mississippi burning case, an investigation had been conducted. Incredibly, thousands of documents for the Dee and Moore case are scattered in public archives throughout the United States, and we would acquire almost 1,600 pages of them over the course of this film. When compiled, the sheer volume of evidence available begs the question, how could this case have not gone to trial, even back in 1964 Mississippi? An invaluable blueprint to the case, the documents describe prime suspects, a recreation of the gruesome torture and murder of Charles Moore and Henry D., and the arrests of 2 men.
It states James Ford Seal, Charles Marcus Edwards.
The FBI believed James Seal to be one of the ringleaders in the killings, but he'd been reported as dead for years. So Thomas's focus was on Charles Marcus Edwards, who he knew was still alive.
I want to see him in jail. That's what I want to see. I want to see him spend the rest of his life worrying about how it would have been had he not did that. Our mission right today is to go to Mississippi and hold individuals, towns, counties, and the state of Mississippi accountable. That's the whole deal. If you know something, why can't you tell others? Who are you afraid of? Hey, David, come here. You see where that storm is over there? That is Mississippi. We are in Mississippi. And somewhere up north here is where they found the bodies of Charles Eddie Moore and Henry D., July 12, 1964.
According to documents, this is what happened on May 2nd, 1964. Around midday, Charles Moore and Henry D. began hitchhiking near the ice cream store in the small town of Meadville, Mississippi. Seal, Edwards, and some other reputed Klansmen picked them up from the roadside, with Seal claiming to be a revenue agent hunting for bootleggers. Seal, Edwards, and the others then drove them into the Homoshido National Forest, a national park that surrounds Meadville.
Just imagine a person tied to a tree, tape over the mouth, legs tied to the tree, probably a rope around the neck, hidden like this, the body.
As a Klan informant stated, both Seal and Edwards participated in the restraining and whipping of Dee and Moore. At this point, Edwards claims he left the scene, having assisted in the kidnapping and beating, and that Dee and Moore were still alive when he left. They were then driven across the Mississippi River, stuffed in the trunk of a small car by other Klansmen who'd been called in to help, and taken to a large island owned by one of the Klansmen on an old oxbow lake formed by the Mississippi River. Upon arrival, Charles Moore was chained to a 1944 Willys Army Jeep engine, and Henry Dee was attached to some old train rails and flywheels. They were taken to the middle of the river, and a Klansman asked one of the boys if he knew what was going to happen to him. He nodded that he did, and with that, Dee and Moore were thrown overboard while still alive. Charles's body was found just over here, and Henry's was found just about right there in the middle.
It's a goddamn shame.
Here is the skull of Charles Moore, recovered by Navy divers nearly 7 months later after the final tip-off from a Klan informant. 6 days after the skull was found, James Seal and Charles Edwards, only 2 of several Klansmen involved in the murders, were arrested. They were released less than 36 hours later, even after making partial confessions.
David Ridgen and Thomas Moore found out that Charles Marcus Edwards was living in the town of Meadville, where he was a well-respected member of the community, the deacon of a local church. So they tried to give him a call.
Hello? Hello, can I speak to Mr. Edwards, please?
Who is this?
My name's David Ridgen, and I'm calling with Thomas Moore. Can I just talk to you for a couple of seconds?
I don't believe you can.
Sir, Mr. Moore's down here trying to... Oh, I guess he hung up.
He hung up?
Hello?
Hello, Mr. Edwards. Sorry. Mr. Moore just wants to talk to you for... Like, all he wants to do is talk to you man to man. What do you think?
I told you that. Yeah, that okay, I don't talk to me. But you tried.